This person says, if God could have not created or created otherwise, isn't there potentiality in God's creative, isn't there potentiality? That's a good question. In God's creative will. Isn't there unactualized potential given creation? That's a great question. Could you reformulate that so people are understanding maybe the question and then respond? Steelman it as Aquinas does.
Okay, well, so the Catholic tradition, okay, so the questioner is referring to two different teachings of Aquinas. One is that, as all Christians traditionally teach, Aquinas holds that God could have not created the world. The world is the mystery of creation is a mystery of divine initiative or divine freedom. We're not an extension of the world. We aren't a necessary, you might say, dimension of God that emanates forth from God by necessity. If we want to talk about creation as an emanation from God, we have to talk about it emanating forth from God by his free, something like what we could call freedom. And at the same time, we say that God, at least Aquinas argues, he's not the only one, of course, that God is pure actuality. There's no unactualized perfection, unactualized imperfection. You know, like God is, if you think about the world as a piano composition, God is like the pianist who's getting better, a little better all the time. He's not quite there yet. And he's creating us to perfect himself. Or, he's like Mozart writing symphonies and getting a little better at symphony writing every time. And we don't want to say that. We want to say God creates us out of the perfect actuality or out of the pure actuality of his infinite perfection. So even if the God had never created the world, he'd still be as perfect as he is without the world. I mean, that's Aquinas' view. Not everyone has always held that, but that's a more mainstream, classical, traditional theist view. And so the questioner is asking, well, but if he had the potency to create or not create, that itself suggests he could become more or less perfect. And there's a capacity to actuate something to render actual in himself, something he didn't render actual. To which the answer is no. The answer is no, because what Aquinas says is you have to distinguish between actual potency and active potency and passive potency. So an active potency, well, I should say a passive potency is the capacity to become more actual in perfection. And so that would be like, I have the potency to become a better mathematician, a better banjo player, I don't know, a better runner or something like that. And we all have all these, professional or moral or technical potentialities in us to improve as creatures. And we don't want to say that there's passive potency of that kind in God, but active potency is what you're talking about when we talk about creation. And that's the capacity of God to give being or not give being out of the antecedent infinite perfection he has as one who alone is infinite and therefore able to create being from non-being. Aquinas has this difficult but interesting argument. I mean, it's difficult for us to get our minds around, but I think it's probably essential to somehow think about it and appeal to it, which is that only one who is infinite in being can give to be what formerly was not. So one thing we cannot do as finite creatures is create what is from what was previously not. We can act upon previously existing things and change them, but we cannot create ex nihilo, or from nothing, with no pre-existing material cause. But God can and does. He gives being to all things in the totality of their being, out of his infinite power. That's not a passive power. That's an active power. It stems from God's purely actual perfection. So you say, well, wait a minute, though. If he could have created this universe or that universe, at least that would change something in him. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's possible to hold that. I mean, there are people who hold that who are theists, but Aquinas doesn't hold that because he thinks that whether he creates this universe or that universe, or he changes the universe that exists now so that it becomes like X or it becomes like Y, he always acts out of the already existing plenitude of his infinite perfection. And according to, you might say, the divine ideas, the knowledge God has of himself and therefore of what he's capable of doing, so that everything that comes to be from God only always comes to be from one who's utterly perfect. Now, so it's not like Mozart, in the sense that Mozart, when he writes more and more symphonies, gets a little better or creates something more perfect or differently perfect in different ways than what he did before. With God, I mean, God is like Mozart perfectly in act, always creating the symphony of the world. He could have created other symphonies. But the difference is it always stems from something utterly perfect in him. And it's always an imperfect reflection of what's transcendently superior and more incomprehensibly perfect in him. So even saying things like God created freely, you have to be careful. We don't really know what it is for God to create. It's mysterious. We know we came to be from one who is somehow, analogically speaking, intelligent, wise, and good, and free. But it isn't an elective freedom that perfects God. It's an elective freedom that stems from an already plenary potency of perfection, of one who can express himself in an infinite number of finite ways, or he could express his infinite plenitude in many finite ways, and it would still always only be the expression of his infinite plenitude. Like, that's not our freedom. That's a different kind of divine freedom. And so, you have to think about divine freedom, divine power, and divine infinity, divine perfection. They go together and they qualify one another. That's why actually study of God's really interesting. It's not just intuitive. Like, the more you do disciplined work of thinking about the divine attributes with Aquinas, the more you actually see, like, God is deeply mysterious. And yeah, I understand a little better, but I also don't understand. I mean, God's an incomprehensible mystery. Not because what I understand about God's contradictory, but just because, like, he's just not a creature. So we have a limited comprehension of his perfection.
Yeah, it's a great answer. You must have had your coffee this morning, have you?
Yeah, I've been reading a book about this stuff.
I was going to say, because the first question was 17 stories higher. This one was like 30. That was excellent. Thank you kindly.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.